Welcome to Random Flyer, the podcast that brings you the true stories from New Zealand's airline history. Today, we're taking a deeper dive into the New Zealand experience of the Fokker Friendship F.27, the development of the fleet, and where they ultimately ended up. By the early 1950s, with the advent of the new turboprop-powered airliners that were about to sweep the world, discussions in New Zealand turned to which type should be selected to replace the DC-3 on the regional networks to which they were being relegated from the north-south main trunk by the incoming Vickers Viscount 807. The main competition for the role was the Fokker F.27 Friendship, the Handley Page Herald, later known as the Handley Page Dart Herald, and later on the Hawker Siddeley HS748, all of which were eventually powered by variants of the Rolls-Royce RB53 Dart turboprop engines. The Handley Page Herald flew first in August 1955, 3 months ahead of the Friendship, but at that time it was still a piston engine plane, fitted with four 650 kilowatt 14-cylinder radial engines, driving 3-blade propellers, while the Friendship had been envisioned from the beginning to start with Dart turboprop engines, and it would not be until 1958 that the Herald would be re-engined, the same year that the Friendship began its commercial service. And, in the event, sales of the Herald were disappointing and contributed in part to the demise of Handley Page in 1970. Meanwhile, in 1955, 2 NAC officers travelled to England to make a final study of the DC-3 replacement. They spent 2 months there interviewing people at Handley Page and Vickers factories, as well as the engine producers Rolls-Royce. By March 1957, it was becoming more obvious that Handley Page had made an error with their engine choice and was struggling to catch up with Fokker, which was now NAC's preferred type to replace the DC-3. And thus, on 10 November 1959, less than a month after the two types were displayed in a competition at the opening of the New Wellington Airport, the government accepted the recommendation of NAC to purchase 4 Friendships in its initial step of replacing the DC-3s. An additional Vickers Viscount turboprop was included to push the British content of the purchases above 60%, as the Friendship itself consisted of considerable value of UK parts in the engine, undercarriage systems and electrical systems. The first to be delivered, ZK BXA, would be delivered in October 1960 and start on the Auckland to Palmerston North and Wellington, Christchurch Invercargill run. Once in service, the Friendship fleet in New Zealand would expand to 24 in batches of 2 or 4 individual units as the DC-3 was phased out, and the introduction was also dependent on the state of the runways at the airports. They would wear several colour schemes over the year, with the first being the DC-3 Skyliner colour scheme, but that was superseded in 1967, with the new colour scheme used for the introduction of the 737 fleet, and another 2 times following the merger with Air New Zealand in 1978. The first planes were Fokker Friendship F.27 Series 100s, which were the basic model that first flew in 1957, and were initially fitted with 36 passenger seats, but that was increased to 40 when used on the main trunk route. The New Zealand models were powered by the Rolls-Royce Dart Mark 6 514-7, that produced 1,245 kilowatts max rated power for takeoff and drove a Dowry Rotol 4-blade variable pitch propeller. Nose-mounted weather radar was fitted to the US production version of the plane, and that was subsequently fitted to the Dutch-built models. The unit required a longer nose cone, which made it quite distinctive from the original versions. First batch came through to New Zealand without the radar and the longer noses, but the rest did, and the initial fleet was retrofitted. In 1976, an interesting opportunity came up with the sale of 6 Friendship nose cones. They stood about 4 feet high, and the store's disposal man at NAC said they might make good playhouses for children. Next came the 500 series Friendship. This model differed from the 100 in that it was about 1.5 metres longer and could carry 48 passengers in the New Zealand configuration, although that number would change depending on the role. It was powered by the updated Dart Mark 7 532-7 with 1,490 kilowatts rated takeoff power. This engine retained the 3 high-pressure and 3 low-pressure turbine stages, but included new materials and cooling, which allowed higher turbine inlet temperatures and created more power. It also featured improved fuel control technology. This gave the engine a 20% boost in power and a 5% lower fuel burn, and takeoff weight was up to above 20 tonnes. There was also a 500F, which was produced for the Australasian market and was the main 500 series used in New Zealand. The difference between the 500 and the 500F was that the plane only had the smaller crew door at the front, without the larger forward cargo door of the other 500 series. The main undercarriage legs were extended, giving the plane a slightly nose-down stance. ZK BXA was the first of NAC's order of 4 new Fokker F.27 100s, and was the 48th Fokker Friendship off the series production line. It was accepted by NAC in Amsterdam on Monday 28 November 1960, and it arrived in Wellington on Monday 12 December following a delivery flight with Captains George Harvey, John Curtis and Peter Buck, as well as 3 NAC engineers. The first flight in service was on Thursday 22 December 1960, just in time for the holiday rush that year. It flew domestic routes for National Airways and then for Air New Zealand from 1978 following the merger. It was withdrawn from use at Christchurch and prepared for lease for the Bapati Nusantara Airlines in April 1978 as PKMFS. The aircraft was badly damaged when it made a wheels-up landing at Palembang on 18 December 1978. The pilot had become distracted with an asymmetric flap situation and forgot to lower the undercarriage. The 35 passengers and 4 crew escaped uninjured. An insurance claim was made against Lloyd Insurance and the aircraft then became a property of the insurance company. It was then sold to PT Airfast Indonesia in September 1979 and registered PKOBP. The aircraft was then sold to Service Air of Belgium in April 1989 and then in 1990 leased to Flanders Airlines, who had taken over Service Air. Flanders Airlines ceased operations due to financial difficulties in February 1992. It was then ferried from Brussels to Dinard in France for storage and was reported to have been sold to Burundi BCR Charter, but the sale fell through and the airplane was scrapped at Dinard in 2009. ZK BXB was the second of the 4 F.27-100s ordered new by NAC on 10 November 1959 and was the 58th friendship built. It was accepted by NAC at Amsterdam on Thursday 9 February 1961. The aircraft was damaged at Invercargill when the left main landing gear retracted at the terminal on Monday 16 October 1961. It flew domestic routes for NAC and then for Air New Zealand from 1978 following the merger. It was withdrawn from use at Christchurch on 1 December 1979 and converted into a navigation training aircraft and was then sold to the RNZAF as part of Project Katuku on 22 February 1980, where it entered service as NZ2781. It was withdrawn from service by the RNZAF in July 1992 and sold to Laog International Airlines in the Philippines on 1 July 1995. This aircraft was accompanied by ZK-BXC and ZK-BXD on the ferry flight. Laog International Airlines ceased operations on 11 November 2002. The plane was observed at Manila without engines and with other major parts missing in February 2003, and it was reported as scrapped at Manila sometime after 2004. ZK-BXC was a third of the first 4 F.27-100s ordered by NAC on 10 November 1959. It was accepted by NAC at Amsterdam on Friday 24 February 1961. It arrived at Whenuapai in Auckland in March 1961 and flew domestic routes for National Airways and then Air New Zealand from 1978 following the merger. It was withdrawn from use in July 1980 and was used by the RNZAF Navigation and Air Electronics Training Squad as part of Project Katuku. It was then sold as one of 3 to Laog International Airlines of the Philippines in 1995 and, accompanied by ZK-BXB and BXD, it was flown there. Following service with Laog International Airlines, it was sold to Presidential Airlines of Cambodia in 1998. Presidential ceased operations in 2007 and the aircraft was scrapped at Phnom Penh in January 2008. ZK-BXD was the last of the initial order of F.27-100s by NAC on 10 November 1959. It arrived at Auckland at Whenuapai in March 1961 and flew domestic routes for National Airways and then for Air New Zealand from 1978 following the merger. During its time at NAC on 7 March 1962, BXD experienced an in-flight smoke problem. Some fabric lining had come into contact with electrical lines causing the smoke. The plane was repaired and returned to service. It was withdrawn from use and sold to the RNZAF in 1980 as NZ2783 for the Navigation and Air Electronics Training Squadron as part of Project Katuku. It was withdrawn from RNZAF service in 1992 and stored at Wigram. It was the third of 4 sold to Laog International Airlines in the Philippines in 1995, but was damaged whilst landing at Mactan Island, whilst engaged in a cargo flight in December that year. During the landing roll, the right main landing gear collapsed and the aircraft left the runway. It was flown to Laog Airport for more permanent repairs, but the work was stopped in 1996 as the aircraft was deemed uneconomical repair. It was observed at Laog Airport in poor condition in 2001 and mostly scrapped. ZK-BXC was the first of the second lot of 4 ordered by NAC on 3rd of May 1960, 6 months after the first block, and was accepted by NAC at Amsterdam Wednesday 30th of August 1961. It was the first of the planes that were fitted with the nose-mounted radar and the longer nose. It arrived at Paraparaumu in September 1961 and flew domestic routes for NAC and then for Air New Zealand from 1978 following the merger. It was withdrawn from use and stored in Christchurch, with its last flight being in November 1981, but as the early 1980s proceeded, additional capacity was required on regional routes, and the plane was brought back into service in 1984. It was withdrawn from service again in 1991 and stored at Christchurch. It was then leased to Continental Aviation Proprietary Limited of India in 1992 and entered the Indian Aircraft Register as VTROY. However, shortly afterwards, regulations were introduced by the Indian government stipulating that aircraft older than 15 years were not permitted to carry passengers, and service by VTROY was terminated in 1993. It was observed intact and parked outside the University at Delhi in 2009, and the aircraft is now used as an instructional airframe in an all-white livery with a dark cheat line. ZK BXF was the second of the second batch of 4 ordered new by NAC and was accepted at Amsterdam on Saturday 9 September 1961 and arrived in Christchurch Wednesday 20th September that year. The plane was then sold to LeaseJet Incorporated in October 1992 and was leased to Mount Cook Airlines until December 1994. The aircraft was then stored at Christchurch without markings before joining 3 other Air New Zealand F.27s that went to Lauag International Airlines Philippines. This one was used as a freighter in 1996. Lauag International ceased operations on 11 November 2002. The airplane was withdrawn from service and stored at Manila, where it was then scrapped. ZK BXG was a third of the second block of 4 ordered new by NAC. It arrived in Christchurch on completion of the ferry flight from Holland on Friday 17 November 1961 and flew domestic routes for NAC and then Air New Zealand following the merger. The aircraft was damaged in a landing accident at Gisborne on 10 October 1988. Temporary repairs were carried out on site and the aircraft was ferried back to Christchurch. On further inspection, when the aircraft arrived back in Christchurch, the extent of the damage became more evident and it went into storage there. It was decided to permanently withdraw the plane from service and it was donated to the RNZF Museum at Wigram on 10 October 1993. It then went to Pioneer Adventures Limited for use as their airport office and then to the Aeroview Museum at Ashburton, without its wings, in January 2005. It was then sold to the Ferrymead Aeronautical Society in Christchurch in August 2011 and was moved there. The wings and tails have been permanently removed and the fuselage was fully restored to post-1968 NAC colours and is now on display inside the museum beside ex-NAC Vickers Viscount 807 ZK BRF. ZK BXH was the last of the second lot of 4 of F-27-100s ordered new by NAC, and it arrived in Auckland on the completion of its delivery flight in November 1961. The early years of this plane's service with NAC were derailed by an apparent surplus of friendships in the NAC fleet. There was an economic downturn in the early 1960s and, in 1963, the airline recorded its first downturn in passenger numbers. The situation for NAC was not helped by the start of South Pacific Airlines of New Zealand, which had also experienced a downturn. Further complicating matters, secondary airfields around New Zealand serving regional centres were not being upgraded as quickly as was expected, meaning that the friendships could not serve many of these airfields. Accordingly, BXH was withdrawn from use and prepared for lease with East West Airlines in Australia in September 1963 and flown there as VHEWH. As Ansett withdrew from South Pacific Airlines of New Zealand during 1964 and cancelled plans for the expansion of the airline, SPANZ began to falter, allowing BXH to return to service with NAC in February 1965. The plane was transferred to Air New Zealand during the 1978 merger. It was withdrawn from use and sold to Australian Aircraft Sales in Sydney in September 1981. However, the aircraft remained in New Zealand and was repurchased by Air New Zealand and returned to service in 1982 to cater for increasing regional demand for air travel. It was finally withdrawn from use and stored at Christchurch in April 1990 and was used by Air New Zealand Engineering Services as a training aid for their engineers. It was dismantled in 2012 and transported by road to the Wanaka Airport for the Wanaka National Transport and Toy Museum, where it's currently on display in Air New Zealand colours. ZK BXI was an individual unit ordered new by NAC on 20 November 1964 and was accepted by NAC in Amsterdam on Tuesday 9 November 1965 and arrived at Christchurch that November. BXI flew domestically in New Zealand and operated its final revenue service on Wednesday, 8 August 1990, when the aircraft was withdrawn from service and stored at Christchurch. It was intended for sale to Continental Aviation Proprietary Limited India, but the sale did not proceed. The aircraft was then donated to the Air New Zealand Training Centre in Christchurch and was stored there until it was acquired by the Chatham Islands Aviation Museum and floated across to the islands from Timaru Harbour in July 2012, where it is now deteriorating in the open air. ZK NAA, an F.27-100 was purchased second-hand from Aer Lingus in Ireland. This aircraft entered the Irish Register as EIAKF in May 1959 and was sold to NAC in January 1966. It was part of a purchase of 4 Series 100 machines from Aer Lingus, which was the last 100 Series French ship that NAC bought. It arrived in Christchurch on the completion of the ferry flight from the Netherlands following conversion there in January 1966. NAA flew domestic routes for NAC and then for Air New Zealand from 1978, following the merger, and was withdrawn from use and placed in storage in the open in Christchurch in May 1981. It was then one of 3 French ships that was sold to Tunis Avia of Tunisia on 19 March 1983 and was registered there as TSTVB. Eventually. The plane began its 14-stop ferry flight to Tunisia accompanied by NAF and NAB. However, when the crews arrived in Athens, they were told that the Tunisian authorities would not allow the planes to carry on to Tunisia. The authorities required a statement to be produced by Tunis Avia, stating that the planes would not be used for military purposes. However, negotiations over the production of the statement were protracted because of language problems. The situation was also leaked to the press in Tunisia, who made an issue of it, causing the government to react by trying to prevent delivery. It was speculated that the discrepancy was leveraged by a competing airplane sales company who wished for the airline to buy machines from them rather than Air New Zealand. Strong lobbying from Tunis Avia and pressure from the New Zealand government eventually resulted in Tunisia agreed to having the registration changed so the plane could carry on to its new owner. However, landing rights would not be granted for another 2 or 3 months, giving the controversy some time to cool. In the meantime, the planes were leased to the North Yemen government. Air New Zealand captains Warren George and Des Lyons carried out the flights to North Yemen in the planes one by one before returning to New Zealand. Following the Athens fiasco, the plane served with operators in the Maldives, with the Yemen Arab Republic Air Force before being sold to Aeronica of Nicaragua, where it entered the register there as YNBZF. However, the plane was lost in an emergency landing accident during the transatlantic ferry flight, crashing in Greenland 280 kilometres inland. The crew experienced difficulty with the ferry tank's installation in the cabin and elected to return to Kursk but crashed before reaching the airport there, killing 2 of the 5 occupants on board. ZK NAB was the second of the 4 F.27-100s purchased second-hand from Aer Lingus in Ireland. This aircraft entered the Irish Aircraft Register as EIAKG in 1959 and was sold to NAC in January 1966. It arrived here on 25 May 1966. It was sold to Tunis Avia in 1983 along with NAF and NAA. It was stopped in Athens during the delivery flight, ostensibly due to discrepancy in the paperwork. It flew for a number of operators over the year, including Yemen Air Force for a year in the mid-80s, Maldives Airways, Air Maldives, the Sudanese Air Force, before being written off in a landing accident while flying for Air Bissau on 15 August 1991. The aircraft was being operated on a ferry flight from Kano International Airport in Nigeria to Bamako in Mali when the crew became disoriented while flying over Burkina Faso. They attempted to make an emergency landing. The plane broke up after striking trees near Dori Airport, killing all 3 of the people on board. ZK NAF was the third of 4 F.27-100s purchased second-hand from Aer Lingus in Ireland. This aircraft was entered into the Irish Register as EIAKE in 1959 and was sold to NAC in January 1966. It arrived here in June 1966. NAF flew for NAC and then Air New Zealand following the merger in 1968. While in service with NAC on Saturday 13 July 1974, NAF was damaged during a landing roll. A fault had developed in the right-hand undercarriage and the plane was diverted to Wellington, where the undercarriage collapsed on the runway. The damage was minor and the plane resumed service shortly after. In May 1981, NAF was withdrawn from use and placed in open storage at Christchurch, where it became the last of 3 F-27s sold to Tunis Avia in March 1983 and was registered there as TS LVA, after having been stopped in Athens on its delivery flight due to paperwork discrepancies. NAF then flew for Maldives Airways, Yemen Arab Republic Air Force, Sudanese Aeronautical Services Company, and Air Basel from 1989. It was reported derelict at Algiers in May 1992. ZK-NAH was the last of the 4 F-27-100s purchased second-hand from Aer Lingus in Ireland. This aircraft was registered there as EIAKA in 1958 and was sold to NAC in June 1966, arriving here in August. EIAKA was the first F-27 delivered to an airline and appeared on the Fokker F-27 promotional material. Before entering service in New Zealand, EIAKA was badly damaged in a landing accident at Glasgow on 22 November 1959. NAH flew domestic flights with NAC and then Air New Zealand after the merger in 1978, but was withdrawn from use and stored in Christchurch on 1st September 1981. It was then sold in Australia and entered the register there as VHNLS in January 1984, where it flew for Air Cruising Australia and Eastern Airlines Australia, before being withdrawn from use again and stored in Brisbane from March 1994. In December 1998, it was leased to Air Cruising New Zealand Limited and flew air tours around the country for visiting Australians. In November 1999, the rear fuselage was damaged by ground service equipment at Rotorua Airport. The plane was repaired and returned to service, but it was sold in 2004 to the Fokker Heritage Trust in the Netherlands, where it was restored to the colours of Dutch commuter airline NLM, and is currently on display there as PHFHF, named Anthony H.G. Fokker. ZK-NAN was the first of the bigger, more powerful Fokker Friendship 500s for NAC, and was the first of 2 bought second-hand from Malaysia-Singapore Airlines in 1973. The plane was originally delivered to ALM Antilles Airlines in the Caribbean in June 1968 as PJFRM. While in service with ALM, the plane was hijacked by armed revolutionaries fleeing from the Dominican Republic on 12 May 1970 during a scheduled flight from Santo Domingo, capital of the Dominican Republic, to the Willemstad, Netherlands airport in the Antilles. The revolutionaries took over the plane and forced it to divert to Havana, Cuba, where the hostages were released unharmed. The plane then went to Malaysia-Singapore Airlines in August 1970 as 9VBCN, and finally became NAN with NAC on 18 July 1973. The 500 series friendships flew domestic routes and also made trips to Norfolk Islands for NAC, and then flew for Air New Zealand from 1978 following the merger. NAN was then transferred to Airwork New Zealand Limited in October 1991 to fly for Air Post, but was damaged beyond repair in Woodburn on 27 February 1993. The plane was conducting a training flight, during which the crew carried out a simulated gear problem exercise using the emergency extending system. However, the crew neglected to insert locking pins to ensure the landing gear remained deployed, and they retracted shortly after landing, causing the fuselage to hit the runway. ZK-NAO was the second of 2 F-27-500s bought second-hand from Singapore Airlines. It was registered 18th of July 1973 to NAC and merged into Air New Zealand in April 1978. It flew domestic routes and made trips to Norfolk Islands for NAC and then Air New Zealand, and the plane was transferred to Airwork New Zealand to fly for Air Post in October 1991 and was scrapped in 2012. ZK-NFA was one of a series of 500 series friendships that were delivered new to NAC between 1977 and 1981. NFA flew domestic routes in New Zealand and out to Norfolk Island, but was withdrawn from use in 1992 and was one of 8 sold to Indonesian Airlines Merpati Nusantara Airlines as PKMFF on 20th of February 1992. NFA is now reported to be in storage. ZK-NFB arrived in New Zealand in 1977 and flew domestically for NAC and Air New Zealand and was withdrawn from use in 1992 before going to Merpati Airlines. The aircraft was withdrawn from service there in 2004 and stored at Surabaya from December 2006, where it is slowly being stripped for parts. In 2014, the fuselage with the wings still attached was observed, but with the engine and tail missing. ZK-NFC was the third second-hand F-27-500 from Malaysia-Singapore Airlines, this time coming from the Malaysian register as 9M APU. Delivered in April 1971. This aircraft was sold to NAC on 13 June 1977 and subsequently it flew domestic services and trips out to Norfolk Island after the retirement of the Qantas DC-4s that Air New Zealand had been chartering for the purpose. NFC was transferred to Air New Zealand as part of the merger there, but was destroyed in a landing approach accident at Auckland Airport on 17 February 1979. The plane was returning from a visit to Gisborne with a pair of engineers who had gone there to service another aircraft. Its arrival in Auckland coincided with heavy prefrontal rain showers ahead of an active cold front. The plane crashed into the Manukau harbour attempting a short ILS approach, 400 metres off the final approach course. It is believed the pilots became disoriented due to the poor visibility and failure to monitor their instruments during a right-hand turn onto the final approach course. The approach was unstable in speed, 11 knots above company regulations, but the captain persevered with the approach despite this, and despite not being able to see the approach slope indicators. It is believed prismatic visual illusion was caused by a build-up of water on the windshield, causing the pilots to believe they were higher above the ground than they really were. 4 people were on board when it crashed. Captain A.J.P. Circuit and ground engineer M.J. Forbes were both killed. The deaths were also attributed to the lack of reliable rescue equipment, with the airport hovercraft being out of service at the time of the crash. ZK NFD was the first Fokker F.27-500 delivered new to Air New Zealand and arrived on 13 March 1980. It flew domestic and Norfolk Island services before being withdrawn from use and stored in Christchurch before being sent to Mapati as part of the 1992 fleet buy and joined the Indonesian register as PKMFI. PKMFI crashed on Saturday 18 June 1994 while flying on a scheduled passenger run between Balikpapan Secondhand Airport and Pulau Matara Airport. On approach to Pulau Matara Airport, the crew encountered poor weather conditions and limited visibility due to rainfall. During the final approach, 4 miles out from the runway, the aircraft struck the side of Mount Kalora at 2,295 feet. The aircraft was destroyed upon impact and all 12 occupants were killed. ZK NFE was a F-27-500 and the second one delivered new to Air New Zealand on 15 April 1980. It flew domestic services for the airline and Norfolk Island services before being withdrawn from use and stored in Christchurch, going to Mapati in 1992. It joined the Indonesian register there as PKMFJ. It was withdrawn from use at Mapati in 2004 and was last seen stored and derelict at Surabaya December 2009 with no engines. ZK NFF was a Fokker Friendship 500 series delivered new to Air New Zealand in 1980. It flew domestic and Norfolk Island services before being withdrawn from use and stored in Christchurch. It was then sent to Mapati as part of the fleet buy in 1992 and joined the Indonesian register there as PKMFK. NFF is currently displayed at Yuanda Naval Base in February 2003 and Surabaya as PKMFK. ZK NFH was delivered new to Air New Zealand in March 1981 and flew domestic services and trips to Norfolk Island before being withdrawn from use and stored in Christchurch and sent to Mapati as part of the fleet buy in 1992, joining the Indonesian register as PKMFL. PKMFL crashed during a training flight at Surabaya Yuanda Airport on Monday 26 March 2001, killing all 3 people on board. The plane was being used to train 2 CN-235 captains for the captaincy of the Fokker F-27. Approaching Yuanda for the 8th touch and go, the aircraft was seen banking to the left and then crashed into shrimp ponds nearby the airport. ZK NFI was delivered to Air New Zealand on 10 July 1981 and then sold to Mapati as PKMFM on the 21st of April 1992. It was withdrawn from use in 2002 and scrapped by 2008. ZK NFJ was the last F-27 delivered to Air New Zealand and came on the 1st of October 1981. It was then sold to Mapati as PKMFN on the 19th of June 1992 and flew with them until 2004. It was noted in 2018, stored at the Surabaya maintenance facility. During the phasing out of the Air New Zealand F-27 Friendship fleet, the company enhanced their stakeholdings in the major regional airlines made up of Mount Cook, Eagle Air and Air Nelson. Air Nelson, who until the late 1980s only operated Metros and light piston twins, was selected to take over most of the Air New Zealand Friendship routes with their newer Saab 340s and Metros. Nelson fell in 1988, followed by Hokitika and Westport, then Timaru. Whanganui went in February 1990, followed by New Plymouth, Rotorua, Tauranga, Gisborne and Blenheim, with many of the North Island services going to Eagle Air. In August 1990, Air New Zealand's decision was made to withdraw the entire Fokker Friendship fleet during 1991. However, the last New Zealand commercial F-27 flight was not for another 27 years, as Airwork New Zealand continued to operate the type with its New Zealand Post contract. They used former Air New Zealand machine ZK-NAN, but also used non-Air New Zealand ZK-PAX. PAX was a 500 series that had been built for Mountain West Airlines in 1980, but the sale did not proceed. It was leased to Mississippi Valley Airlines Incorporated that year, but was withdrawn from service in 1985, when Mississippi Valley Airlines merged with Air Wisconsin Incorporated. It then flew briefly for Suburban Airlines, training as Allegheny Commuter Airline in 1986, before being returned to Fokker USA in 1987. It was then leased to Sudan Airways, Royal Air Maroc, Shrena Airways BV, and Air Inter Gabon, all in 1988. It there went to French operator CNET in 1990 and was withdrawn from service here in 1996 and was sold. It was stored at various locations around Europe before being sold to Airwork Holdings Limited in 2003, where it was registered ZKPAX to operate the New Zealand Post contract until that was terminated in March 2016. Following the termination, on the night of 1 September 2016, PAX flew from Auckland to Christchurch as Post 675. It landed in Christchurch around midnight and turned round for its return to Auckland, and at 2 a.m. it took off again and flew into history.